4 mornings home, and I still hadn't slept lying down. I was folded into the back seat of my mother's 2003 Buick LeSabre in the Superstore lot, off 18th Street in Brandon, holding her hand across the gap between the seats because the gear shift was in the way, and that was the closest we could get to each other. Her breath was fogging. The car was off. She'd been rationing the gas to run the heater in 20-minute bursts so the battery wouldn't die, and the windows had gone white with frost on the inside, little crystal ferns climbing up from the corners. She had 3 blankets on her, and a toque pulled down over her ears, and she was 87 years old, and she was apologizing to me for the smell of the car. That's the part I keep coming back to. 87, 11 nights in a parking lot, November in Manitoba, and what she wanted me to know was that she was sorry the car smelled like the McDonald's drive-through coffee she'd been nursing to stay warm. My name is Stan Whitfield. I'm 63 years old. I ran heavy equipment my whole working life, and I was still running it that fall, up at a camp past Thompson, because they were short 2 operators, and the money for a double rotation was the kind of money you don't say no to when you're trying to top off an RRSP that took a beating in '08. So I was gone 7 weeks. No cell service worth anything up there. A satellite phone in the trailer for emergencies, and you had to know to call it, and nobody called it, because the one person who could have didn't think my mother sleeping in a car counted as an emergency. This is the story of what I came home to, and what I did about it. Stick around, because I need you to hear the whole thing before you judge any single part of it. And if you've got people you love who are getting older, drop a line in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I read them. It matters to me lately, knowing there are people out there who'd open a door. Let me back up. My mother is Pearl. She was born in 1938 on a farm near Souris, the kind of place that doesn't exist anymore except as a quarter section somebody else farms now. She married my dad, Harold, when she was 19, Harry. He worked the rail yard in Brandon for 34 years and died 10 years back, quietly, in a chair the way he did most things. They were married 51 years. After he passed, my mother stayed in their house on 11th Street, the one they bought in 1971 for next to nothing and paid off slow, and she filled it the way she filled everything, with other people's needs. She was the one who brought the casserole. She was the one who remembered which kid in the church basement had a birthday. She knit, and she canned, and she kept a garden in a city that does its level best to kill a garden, and she never once in 87 years asked anybody for a thing she hadn't earned twice over. And there was my brother Clifford, 2 years younger than me, and the better of the 2 of us by a mile, which I say without it costing me anything, because it's just true. Cliff went through the ice on Clear Lake the winter he was 31, on a snowmobile, coming back across at dusk, the way we'd both done 100 times growing up, except the one time the lake didn't hold him. That was 20-something years ago now, and I still can't write the number down. My mother kept his photograph on the wall in the front hall her whole life after that. Cliff, at maybe 19, standing on the dock at the lake with a stringer of pickerel, squinting into the sun, grinning like the whole world was a joke he was in on. Every Christmas she set a place for him. Not as a show. She just couldn't make herself not. Now I have to tell you about my wife, because she's the one who closed the door, and I want you to understand her the way I understood her, which was slowly, and then all at once. Her name was Vivian. My second marriage, my first wife and I split amicably in the 90s, no kids, no drama, just 2 people who'd run out of road. Vivian and I had been married 9 years. She was 57, she'd worked in commercial real estate, she had a very particular way of moving through a house, straightening things, adjusting the thermostat by 1 degree, lining up the remotes. I used to find it charming. I told myself it was just order and there's nothing wrong with order. The first crack I should have seen and didn't was the Afghan. When Vivian and I got married, my mother spent the better part of 2 winters knitting an Afghan for us wool. A pattern she made up herself, blues and grays like the lake in October. It was a beautiful thing. It probably should have been hanging in a gallery. Vivian held it up, said, "Oh, isn't that something?" Folded it back into the box it came in, and put it on the top shelf of the hall closet, where it stayed for 9 years. I knew where it was the whole time. I never said anything, that's on me. Here's what happened while I was up north. It was a Tuesday night in early November, the kind of cold that hasn't fully committed yet. Frost on the windshields, but the river's not locked up. The wiring in my mother's old house had been a worry for years. An electrician told her back in the spring it wanted a full rewire, and she said she'd think about it, which is what my mother said about any expense over $50. That night, something in the wall behind the kitchen let go. She woke to the smoke alarm and the smell, and she got herself out the front door in her housecoat and her boots with no socks, and she stood on the lawn on 11th Street and watched 50 years of her life go orange against the sky. She got out with almost nothing. Her purse, because it was by the door, and Cliff's photograph, off the wall in the front hall, because her hands took it down on the way past, without asking the rest of her. She told me later she didn't decide to. She just found herself standing on the frozen grass holding her dead son's face in a cracked frame, and she said it was the only thing she grabbed and she'd grab it again. The fire department was good to her. The Red Cross came, they do that here, they're decent about it, and they put her up in a motel out on the highway for 3 nights, and gave her a voucher for some clothes at the Walmart. 3 nights. Then the voucher ran out, and the insurance was the trouble it always is. The house had been underinsured for years, because she'd never updated the policy, and the replacement cost had run away from her premium, and the adjuster said the check would come, but these things take weeks. And in the meantime there was a gap. 3 nights of motel, and then a gap, and an 87-year-old woman standing in a parking lot with a garbage bag of donated clothes and a cracked photograph in a 2003 Buick. She did the thing anyone would do. She drove to family, she drove to my house. She had her own key, she'd had a key to our place for years. But the chain was on, which it never was, and so she knocked. It was after 9. Vivian came to the door in her housecoat. My mother stood there in the cold and said, "Vivian dear, there's been a fire, the house is gone. I don't want to be a bother, I just need a few days until Stan's back and the insurance sorts out." And my wife looked at my 87-year-old mother, and she said the house wasn't really set up for a guest right now, and she had a lot on with work, and she needed her space and her routine, and she just didn't think it was a good time. And she closed the door. 3 bedrooms, 2 of them empty, the door closed. My mother stood on the step for a minute. She told me this much later, when she could finally talk about it, and then she got back in the Buick, because she didn't know what else to do, and she was too ashamed to drive to anyone else. Think about that shame. She'd spent 87 years being the one who helped. The idea of going to a neighbor, or the church, or what was left of her friends, most of them gone now, or in care, or moved to be near their kids in Calgary. The idea of showing up at one of those doors as a charity case, after her own son's wife had turned her away, it was more than she could carry. She figured she'd just manage. A few days. The insurance would come. Stan would be home. She managed for 11 nights. She parked in the superstore lot because it was lit, and there were people around in the daytime, and a washroom inside she could use. She ran the heater in short bursts. She ate from the deli and drank coffee to stay warm, and she slept sitting up with the blankets the Red Cross had given her, and at 87 her body did not forgive her for any of it. And the whole time, 4 kilometers away, my wife slept in our bed in our warm house with 2 empty bedrooms and ran her routine, undisturbed. I want you to sit in that for a second the way I've had to. I flew into Winnipeg on a Saturday and drove the 2.5 hours west to Brandon. Tired in the way camp tires you, that bone-deep emptiness where you've been running on a schedule somebody else set for so long you've forgotten how to want anything but a shower and a bed. I was thinking about a real coffee. I was thinking about lying down flat. I called Vivian from the road, and she said she couldn't wait to see me and asked me to grab milk. And that was the whole conversation. Milk, can you believe it? Then I tried my mother, the way I always did first thing home, and she didn't pick up. I figured she was at bingo, or out, or her phone was dead, which it often was. I tried twice more between Portage and Brandon. Nothing. I got home, and the house was exactly as it always was, which I would come to find unbearable. Vivian was on the couch with her phone. She looked up and smiled and said, "You're early," and asked again about the milk. Something was off in the house. It took me a minute to place it, the way you can't find a word. The hall closet door was open a crack, and the Afghan box was sitting out on the floor, and I thought, that's strange. And then I let it go because I was tired, and because I had a worry chewing at me that I couldn't name yet. I tried my mother one more time, standing in my own kitchen, and this time she answered. "Hi, Stanley," she said, and the way she said my name stopped me cold. I've known that voice my whole life. I know what it sounds like at the bottom and what it sounds like at the top, and right then it was being held very carefully. The way you hold a glass you know is cracked. "Mum, where are you?" I said. A pause. The kind of pause that's worse than any answer. "I'm fine," she said. I'm at the superstore. What do you mean you're at the superstore? It's 8 o'clock at night. And she told me, plainly the way her generation tells a hard thing, like she was reading a weather report. The fire, the house gone, the motel that ran out. She got to the part where she went to our house, and there she stopped, and I felt the floor of the world tilt under me. Mum, I said, did you come here? Did you come to the house? Silence. Mum, did you ask Vivian? And my mother, God love her, tried to protect my wife even then. It wasn't a good time for her, she said. It's all right, Stanley. I've managed. I was standing in my own kitchen with my own wife 40 feet away on the couch, and I have never in my life, not at a funeral, not at the lake the day they brought Cliff up, felt a thing like what came up through me then. I asked my mother where exactly she was parked. I told her to stay put. I told her I loved her and I'd be there in 15 minutes. I did not say a word to Vivian. I picked up my coat and my keys and I walked out the door, and I heard her say, "Where are you going? What about the milk?" And I let the door close behind me without answering, because I did not trust what was in my mouth. I drove to the superstore. The lot was mostly empty, that orange sodium light coming down on the snow, and I found the Buick way out near the cart corral, frost on every window. I knocked on the glass, and my mother startled awake, and then she saw it was me, and I watched my mother's face do something I will see for the rest of my life. She didn't cry out. She put both her hands over her mouth, and her shoulders shook, and she made no sound at all, which is so much worse than crying. I got the door open, and I knelt down on the cold pavement of that parking lot in my camp boots, 63 years old, and I put my arms around my mother, who weighed less than she should have, and I felt how cold she was through the blankets, and I thought, very clearly and very quietly, my wife did this. Vivian put my mother here. I'd been home less than 3 hours. I got her into my truck, ran the heat full, drove her to a Tim Hortons drive-through, and made her drink a hot tea while I called around, and found a room at a clean little motel by the river. And I sat with her until she was warm and fed, and she finally slept lying down for the first time in 11 nights. Then I drove home. Vivian was still on the couch. She looked up and said, "There you are, where'd you run off to?" With this little smile, like nothing, like an ordinary Saturday. I stood in the doorway of my own living room, and I said very quietly, "Where has my mother been sleeping for the last 11 nights, Vivian?" The smile adjusted. I watched it happen. It's a thing I'd never noticed before, the way her face recalculated, looking for the angle. "Stan," she said. Don't make this into something." "She's been in her car," I said. "In a parking lot. In November. She's 87. She came to this house, and you shut the door on her. And here's the part I wasn't ready for. She didn't apologize. She didn't even pretend to. She set her phone face down on the cushion and she crossed her arms and she explained. "I can't just have someone move in here without us talking about it," she said. "I have a routine, Stan. I have my work. I'm not a caregiver. That's not who I am. That's not what I signed up for. And you know how these things go. A few days becomes a few weeks becomes never. I'm sorry about the fire, I am, but I didn't start the fire, did I?" She said it almost lightly. "I didn't start the fire." Like a slogan. Like that settled it. "That's my mother," I said. She looked at me, and she looked at the wall, and then she looked back at me, and she said the thing that ended us. Though I didn't put the papers in for another month, she said, "Well, she's not my mother, Stan. She's not my mother. The woman who knit you an Afghan over 2 winters. The woman whose son's photograph survived a fire. The woman who set a place at her table every Christmas for a boy who went through the ice. The woman who, 4 kilometers from your warm bed, was rationing the gas in a Buick to keep from freezing. She's not my mother." I didn't yell. "I want you to know that. I'd have given a lot to be a yeller right then, but I've never been one. And anyway, yelling would have given her something. A fight, a scene, a story she could tell where I was unreasonable." I just looked at her for a long moment, and then I went down the hall and I took the Afghan box off the floor where it had somehow ended up, and I carried it out to my truck, and I drove back to the motel, and I sat in the chair by my mother's bed while she slept, with that Afghan over my own knees, until the sun came up gray over the Assiniboine. If you've got a parent who's getting on, do me one favor while you're watching this. Pick up the phone tomorrow and call them. Not for anything. Just to hear the voice. You'll understand why in a minute. The next morning I rented a furnished suite by the week, 2 bedrooms, and I moved my mother into it. And I made her the beef barley soup she taught me to make when I was a boy, the one with the splash of vinegar at the end that she swears is the secret, and probably is. And then I went home and I did not move out, not yet, because I'd decided something on the drive back and I wanted to do it right, which meant doing it slow. The next while in that house was a quiet kind of war. I didn't sleep in our room. I took the spare. Vivian acted, at first, like this was a tantrum she could wait out. She kept her routine. She made loud, performative sighs when I made my mother's soup in the kitchen that I now thought of as my mother's kitchen, even though my mother had never set foot in it. She'd say things to the ceiling. Some people, she'd say, make a person feel like a criminal in her own home. She started taking long baths with the door shut and coming out with the put-upon look of a woman bearing a great injustice with grace. And me, I just got very calm. I went to see my mother every evening after work. I'd taken a couple weeks off the rotation. I'd bring groceries, sit with her, and she'd tell me she didn't want to be any trouble, and I'd tell her she was the opposite of trouble. She was the reason. One night I caught her in the little kitchen of that suite at 2 in the morning, with Cliff's photograph propped against the napkin holder, and a cup of tea gone cold, just sitting. I made myself a cup and sat down across from her and didn't ask. After a while she touched the edge of the cracked frame and she said, "He'd be 53 this year. Can you picture your brother at 53, Gray?" I said. Cranky. Still couldn't tie a decent knot. She laughed. A real one, the first I'd heard since I got home. Then it faded the way it does, and she said, "He used to say you don't get to pick your blood, but you sure get to pick who you stand by." She looked at me. "He'd have stood by you. He'd have driven over to that house and stood on the lawn and shamed her till the neighbors came out. He'd have brought a sign," I said, "professionally printed." "2 signs," she said, and we both laughed, and then we both stopped, because Cliff was in the room the way he always is, taking up the space he takes up, and the kitchen was very quiet, and outside the prairie night went on for 1,000 kilometers in every direction. I drove home under a sky so full of stars it looked like a mistake, and somewhere out past the city limits I knew exactly what I was going to do and exactly how. 3 days later I sat Vivian down at the kitchen table. No raised voice. I'd packed 2 bags that morning, and they were already in the truck where she couldn't see them. "I'm not going to tell you you've been a monster," I said. "You're not. You're a person who, when it came down to it, looked at someone who needed you and decided your routine was worth more. That's all it was. That's the whole thing." She started to say something about how unfair this was, how I was twisting it. "My mother loved you," I said. "She didn't keep score. She knit you something with her hands over 2 winters and you put it in a closet, and I let that go because it was just a blanket. But this wasn't a blanket. She stood on this step in the cold and asked you for a few nights, and you closed my door on her. And she slept in a car for 11 nights and was too ashamed to tell anyone. And you slept here and you asked me to bring home milk. So you're choosing her," Vivian said, flat, precise, the real estate voice. "Over me. Over your own marriage." "Yes," I said, "I am. I chose it the second I knelt down on that parking lot. The paperwork's just catching up." "You'll regret this," she said. "Maybe," I said, "but not tonight." I stood up. I looked at her one more time, at the woman I'd married, and I found I didn't have anything left in me but the one true sentence. "You should have just opened the door, Vivian," I said. "That's all it ever was. One night. You just had to open the door." I filed before the month was out. She kept the house. It was hers before we married, as it turned out. And I didn't fight her for a square inch of it, because I didn't want a single thing that had her in it. I took my mother instead. I found her a place that winter, a little rented bungalow on Birchwood Crescent, single story, a covered front porch, a backyard with room for a garden. Nothing fancy. The landlord was a younger fellow named Lorne who'd lost his own dad the year before and knocked $30 off the rent when he found out the situation, which is the other side of people, the side you forget exists until somebody shows it to you. I paid the rent. I'll say that plainly because choosing your family sometimes has a number on it, and you write the check without blinking. Between my CPP and the bit of pension and what was still coming off the rotation, I made it work, and my mother's OASs covered the groceries and then some. And for the first time since the fire, she had her own door, with her own lock, that nobody could close on her but her. The insurance check finally came in the spring, less than it should have been, the way it always is, and she put it in a GC and wouldn't touch it, because she's Pearl, and that's what Pearl does with money. She planted that first spring like a woman with something to prove. Tulip bulbs went in late the previous fall, the few weeks before the ground locked, her on her knees in the cold with a trowel while I held the bag, and they came up in May along the front of the porch, red and yellow, exactly the way she'd had them on 11th Street for 40 years. She put in tomatoes that hadn't a hope of ripening before the frost, and ripened anyway. Because the prairie does that, it gives you nothing all year and then gives you everything in 8 weeks. Lorne's kids took to wandering over. She'd give them cookies, and they'd help her pull weeds, and I'd come by after work and find my 87-year-old mother running a little operation out of that backyard like she'd lived there her whole life. On a Saturday in June, I helped her hang Cliff's photograph. We'd had it reframed, clean wood, new glass, the cracked frame retired to a drawer in her bedroom because she couldn't throw it out, and I understood. We hung it over the little buffet in the front room where the afternoon light came in. She stood back with her hands folded and looked at it for a long time and said, "Soft, there's my boy." "There he is," I said. The light caught the glass, and for a second Cliff looked like he was about to say something. That grin, the stringer of pickerel, 19 and certain the world was a joke he was in on. He'd have stood by me. He did, in a way. He was in the kitchen the night I decided, sitting between my mother and me. It's been a while now. I sit with my mother most evenings. She cooks, she's back in a kitchen, and she's herself in a kitchen, and after supper we take our coffee out to the porch and watch the sky do the thing only a prairie sky does, where it goes gold and then pink and then a bruised purple that runs the whole width of the world. And on the clear nights, later, sometimes the northern lights come up green over the rooftops, and we just sit and watch them and don't say much. We're both comfortable with quiet. I got that from my dad, and I didn't know I had it until I was old enough to notice. One night in August, the two of us out there, coffee going cold, she said out of nowhere, "Your brother would have made an awful lot more noise about all this than you did." "He'd have live-streamed it," I said. "From the parking lot. Vivian would have been famous. He'd have brought the signs. Multiple signs," I said. "Professionally printed." She laughed, low, and shook her head, and we sat there smiling at the same person, the same absence, the one that takes up room in every place the two of us will ever be together. Through the screen door I could hear nothing, just the tick of the house cooling, and beyond the yard a dog barking 2 streets over, and the whole flat country breathing out the day's heat into the dark. I'm 63, my marriage is gone, and I don't grieve it the way I thought I might. I grieve the early part, the version of Vivian I thought I'd married, the one who maybe never existed. My brother's been gone more than 20 years, and I'll miss him every day I've got left. But my mother rebuilt out of ash. Again, the second time in her life she's done it. And she lives in a little house on Birchwood Crescent with the best garden on the block. And I helped hang her boy on the wall, and nobody is ever going to close a door on her again while I'm above ground. Here's the only thing I want you to take from this, and then I'll let you go. When the fire happened, my wife had one moment, one door. She looked at a person who'd loved her without keeping score, and she had the chance to be the kind of human being my mother had spent 87 years being, and instead she chose her routine. That's the whole story. Everything else, the 11 nights, the car, the divorce, the rental, the tulips, everything else is just what happened because of that one closed door. Your parents won't always be strong. There's going to be a night, and maybe it's already come for some of you, when the people who raised you call, and they're trying so hard not to sound frightened, and they're standing somewhere they never in their lives imagined they'd be standing. And in that moment, you're going to find out something true about yourself, something you don't get to choose in advance. I found out who I was on the cold pavement of a superstore parking lot, kneeling beside a Buick. I know exactly who I am now, and I'd kneel back down without being asked. So call them tomorrow. And if you've got a door, when the time comes, open it.